A 4-year-old street urchin finds a millionaire being beaten by a gang of clowns in an abandoned circus. But she appears behind them with a piece of iron and does something shocking. Comment giving a score of 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The scorching midday sun beat down on the bustling streets of Chicago when a small, gaunt figure emerged from a foul-smelling alley. The 4-year-old girl, who looked barely 2 due to the severe malnutrition ravaging her fragile body, stumbled along the cracked sidewalks in search of any scrap of food she could find. Her bare feet, covered in sores and dirt, left small, bloody footprints on the hot asphalt. The tattered and filthy dress she wore was no longer a defined color, reduced to rags that barely covered her thin frame. Tangled hair fell over her small face, partially obscuring the large, deep-set eyes that reflected a hunger that went far beyond the need for food. The routine was always the same, scouring the city's downtown streets during the hottest hours, when people hid in air-conditioned spaces and rummaging through trash cans for anything that could soothe the constant ache in her stomach. That day, however, something different caught her attention. Shouts echoed from a direction she had never explored before. These weren't the usual cries of street arguments or hawkers. They were cries of pain, of despair, coming from a place that seemed long abandoned. Childlike curiosity, even amidst extreme suffering, pushed her towards those sounds. Following a side street that led to the outskirts of the city, she found the ruins of what had once been a circus. The rusted metal structures and torn tarpaulins told the story of a place that had once housed joy and fun, but now served only as shelter for rats and forgotten memories. It was through a crack in the broken fence that she saw the scene that would change her life forever. 5 men wearing grotesque clown masks surrounded a figure on the ground. The man being beaten wore expensive clothes, even if they were now torn and blood-stained. He was tall, handsome, with the look of a movie star, but at that moment he was completely defenseless against the fury of his attackers. The clown's fists came down violently on the body of the 30-year-old entrepreneur, who tried to protect himself as best he could. The distorted masks seemed even more sinister under the light filtered by the deteriorating tarpaulins of the abandoned circus. Each blow was accompanied by curses and threats that the girl did not fully understand, but which carried a deep hatred. Something inside that famished child awoke. Maybe it was a distant memory of when someone had protected her, or simply a primal instinct to help those who were suffering. Without thinking about the consequences, she began to look for something she could use. Her small fingers closed around a rusty piece of iron that had come loose from one of the circus structures. It was heavy for her fragile hands, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. With all the courage she could muster in her tiny body, she slipped through the crack in the fence. The first blow she struck on the leg of one of the attackers took everyone by surprise. Her sharp screams echoed through the empty space, mingling with the sound of the iron hitting the masked men's legs. "Stop! Stop hurting him!" she shouted with all the strength of her small lungs, swinging the piece of iron with desperate determination. The surprise was so great that the 5 men stopped for a moment, staring incredulously at that tiny figure who dared to face them. One of the clowns laughed sarcastically, but when he went to approach the girl, she managed to land a direct hit on his knee, causing him to scream in pain. The ensuing chaos lasted only a few minutes. Between the confusion caused by the unexpected intervention and the fear that someone might hear the commotion, the attackers decided to flee. They ran through the same entrance through which they had arrived, leaving behind only shouted threats and the injured man on the dusty floor. The girl dropped the piece of iron, which fell with a metallic noise in the silence that followed. Her small hands trembled, not from fear, but from a mixture of relief and shock at what she had just done. Never in her short life had she faced anyone, let alone a group of adult men. The entrepreneur tried to get up, groaning in pain. Blood streamed from cuts on his face and hands, and it was obvious that some ribs were bruised by the way he moved. When his eyes met the girl's, something changed in his expression. It wasn't just gratitude, but a complex mixture of surprise, admiration, and something he himself couldn't define. You saved me," he murmured in a hoarse voice, trying to wipe the blood that trickled from a cut on his forehead. The girl just watched him, not knowing what to say. She had acted on impulse, and now that the situation had passed, hunger and fatigue returned to dominate her thoughts. She was about to walk away when the man reached out towards her. "Wait," he said, struggling to his feet. "What's your name? Where are your parents?" The question echoed in the air, like a cruel reminder of her reality. Parents were something she didn't have, an abstract concept she saw only when she watched other families on the streets. But there was something in that man's voice, a kindness she rarely encountered, that made her stay there, watching him with her large, cautious eyes. The entrepreneur managed to stand up completely, wiping the blood from his face with the sleeve of his expensive, torn shirt. His net worth in dollars had allowed him to always solve problems with money, but this time, a hungry child had been his salvation. He watched the girl with renewed attention, noticing the details that haste and pain had not allowed him to see before. She was clearly malnourished, with arms as thin as dry twigs and a face marked by chronic hunger. The clothes she wore were shapeless rags, and her bare feet were covered in infected sores. More than that, there was a disturbing maturity in her eyes, as if she had lived much longer than her 4 years would allow. "You don't have anywhere to live, do you?" he asked in a softer voice, crouching down to her height. The girl shook her head slowly, without looking away. She had learned to distrust adults, but something about this man was different. Maybe it was the vulnerability she had witnessed, or the way he spoke without shouting or threatening. "What's your name?" he insisted, trying a more direct approach. "I don't have a name," she replied in a small, hoarse voice. "People just call me Street Kid." The answer hit the entrepreneur like a punch to the stomach. His fortune accumulated over the years, investing in stock market shares, had bought everything he could want, but he had never faced such a stark reality as that child, without a name, without a family, without hope. "Well, everyone needs to have a name," he said, extending his hand carefully. "How about I give you one, and in return you let me take care of you for a while?" The girl looked at the outstretched hand with distrust. In her limited experience, adults who made promises usually wanted something in return, something she didn't want to give. But there were signs that this man was different. The way he spoke, the expensive clothes even torn, and especially the fact that she had just saved him. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because you saved my life," he replied honestly. "And because no one should live on the streets, especially a child." After a few moments of hesitation, she placed her dirty little hand in his. The contrast was stark. The soft, well-groomed skin of the entrepreneur against the rough and injured skin of the girl. He carefully guided her out of the abandoned circus, stopping only to pick up his cell phone that had fallen during the assault. The walk to where he had left the car was slow. The entrepreneur limped due to his injuries, and the girl had difficulty keeping up with his long strides. He had to stop several times, not only because of his own pain, but because he realized she was exhausted. The luxury vehicle was parked a few blocks away, on a busier street where he had found it safe to leave it. It was an imported model that had cost a small fortune, but now seemed insignificant compared to what had just happened. "I've never been in a car like this," murmured the girl when he opened the door for her. "Never?" he asked, surprised at the simplicity of the observation. She shook her head, cautiously touching the leather seat as if it were something magical. During the following minutes, as he drove through the streets of Chicago towards the affluent neighborhoods, she remained silent, watching through the window a world she had always seen from the outside. The mansion gradually appeared as they approached the city's most expensive neighborhood. It was an imposing construction with manicured gardens and a facade that screamed wealth and status. For the entrepreneur, it was just his home. For the girl, it was something out of an impossible dream. "Do you live here?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I do. And now you will too," he replied, parking in the large garage that housed two other equally expensive cars. As they entered through the main door, they were greeted by the sound of high heels tapping on the marble of the entrance hall. The entrepreneur's wife appeared at the top of the elegant staircase, descending with the haughty posture of someone who has always had everything she wanted in life. She was a beautiful 28-year-old woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that cost more than many people earned in a year. Her face, however, contorted into an expression of disgust when she saw the dirty child next to her injured husband. "What is this?" she asked in a cold voice, descending the last steps as if approaching something contaminated. "This is the girl who saved my life," explained the entrepreneur, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "She's going to stay with us for a while." "Absolutely not," replied the socialite, crossing her arms. "Look at her. She's dirty, smelly, probably full of diseases. I won't allow this thing to enter my house." The girl shrank back at the cruel words. She had faced many humiliations on the street, but something in that woman's voice cut deeper than usual. Perhaps it was because, for a few minutes in the car, she had begun to believe that her life could change. "She's not a thing," said the entrepreneur, his voice gaining a firmness that surprised even him. "She is a child who needs help." "And since when did we become an orphanage?" retorted the wife, approaching them with eyes flashing with anger. "You show up here all beaten up with this beggar and expect me to be okay with it?" "She saved me," he repeated, trying to keep calm. "If it wasn't for her, I'd be dead now." "How convenient," said the socialite sarcastically. "A perfect story to justify your new charity craze. But not in my house." The ensuing argument was intense and painful. The woman made it clear that she would not give up her luxurious lifestyle to accommodate a street child. She talked about her social reputation, about what her friends would say, about the risks of having a person like that living in the same house. The entrepreneur tried to argue, appealed to his wife's compassion, even mentioned the money she spent on trifles that could easily cover the costs of caring for the girl. But he found only a wall of coldness and refusal. Throughout the discussion, the girl remained still, watching the dynamics between the wealthy couple. She was quickly learning that even people with a lot of money had their own problems, their own cruelties. The difference was that they could be cruel with style. "Choose," said the socialite finally, with a coldness that cut through the air. "Either she leaves or I leave. I'm not going to live in the same house as this thing." The silence that followed was heavy and embarrassing. The girl looked at the man who had promised to take care of her, seeing uncertainty in his eyes for the first time. She began to understand that maybe the promises of adults were not as solid as she had expected, and that even those who had a lot of money could not buy everything they wanted. The entrepreneur looked at his wife and then at the girl, feeling the weight of a decision that would change everything. His fortune, built over years of smart investments, had always solved any problem, but now he was facing a dilemma that money could not solve. The coldness in the socialite's eyes was absolute, and he realized that he knew his own wife less than he thought. "She stays," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "At least until we find a better solution." The woman's reaction was explosive. Her eyes flashed with a fury that completely transformed her beautiful face into something almost unrecognizable. "You chose a beggar over your own wife," she screamed, throwing her designer bag on the marble floor. "I chose to do what's right," he replied, surprised by his own determination. "Very well," she said, climbing the stairs with furious steps. "When you get tired of playing saint, I'll be at my mother's apartment. Don't come looking for me as long as that thing is here." The sound of the bedroom door slamming echoed through the mansion, followed by the noises of drawers being opened and closed violently. In less than an hour, the socialite had packed her most expensive clothes and left the house, leaving only her expensive perfume in the air and a feeling of emptiness that all the wealth in the world could not fill. The girl watched everything in silence, sitting on the armchair in the main room like a wounded bird. She had caused the separation of that couple, even without fully understanding the dynamics of their fights. Part of her felt guilty. Another part was relieved not to have to face the woman's disgusted look anymore. "Hungry?" asked the entrepreneur, trying to break the heavy silence that had settled in the house. She nodded shyly. She had spent the whole day looking for food, and the dramatic events had not diminished the constant pain in her stomach. He led her to the luxurious kitchen, an environment that seemed straight out of a magazine, with expensive appliances and a central marble island that was larger than many hotel rooms. As he prepared a simple sandwich for her, the entrepreneur noticed how the girl watched every move with total attention. It was as if she were memorizing every detail of that new and strange world. When he put the plate in front of her, he saw how her eyes filled with tears. "It's okay," he said gently. "Eat slowly." She obeyed, chewing each piece as if it were the most precious treasure. There was a natural education in her gestures, even amidst desperate hunger. Someone, at some point in her life, had taught her basic table manners. The following days established an odd routine. The entrepreneur left in the morning to handle company matters, leaving the girl in the care of the housekeeper, a middle-aged woman who was initially shocked by the situation, but gradually developed a genuine affection for the child. It was during one of those mornings, a week after the incident at the circus, that the entrepreneur received the call that would change everything again. He was in his office, reviewing contracts and trying to focus on the stock market numbers, when his personal lawyer called urgently. "I need you to come to my office immediately," said the man, his voice filled with alarming seriousness. "There's something about your company you need to know." The meeting revealed a devastating reality. For months, his majority partner had been siphoning funds from the construction company through fraudulent contracts. Shell corporations were created to justify non-existent expenses, while the real money was directed to offshore accounts. The company's assets, which included investments in Bitcoin and diversified applications, were being systematically plundered. "How much?" asked the entrepreneur, feeling the blood run cold in his veins. "From what we've been able to track so far, almost 80% of the company's assets," replied the lawyer, showing documents that looked like a financial death sentence. "Your construction company is technically bankrupt." The information took a few seconds to be processed completely. Decades of work, his reputation in the market, his carefully planned investments, everything had disappeared while he blindly trusted the partner he considered a friend. "And there's more," continued the lawyer hesitantly. "The creditors have already been notified. You have 72 hours to present a payment plan, or they will execute all of your personal assets." The entrepreneur left the lawyer's office like a defeated man. The mansion he had proudly shown to the girl, the luxury cars, the brimming bank accounts, everything would be taken to pay debts he didn't even know existed. His wealth in dollars and euros, which had always been his shield against the adversities of the world, had evaporated overnight. When he arrived home, he found the girl playing in the garden with some simple toys that the housekeeper had bought. She ran to him with a genuine smile, the first he had seen on her face since he met her. For a moment, he completely forgot about the financial catastrophe that was befalling him. "How was your day?" she asked, with the naturalness of a daughter asking her father. He knelt in front of her, seeing in the child's eyes an innocence that contrasted brutally with the cruel complexity of the adult world. How to explain to a 4-year-old girl that in 3 days they could be on the street. How to tell her that the man who had promised to take care of her was losing everything. It was difficult, he replied honestly, running his hand through the girl's already clean hair. When I lived on the street, every day was difficult, she said with a disturbing wisdom, but they always passed. The simplicity of the observation hit him like a lightning bolt. That child, who had lost everything before she even had something to lose, was trying to comfort him. There was a strength in her that he had never noticed, a resilience forged by necessity that made his own crisis seem smaller. That night, while the girl slept in the guest room that had become her refuge, the entrepreneur stayed awake, calculating options. He tried to contact his partner, but all the phones had been disconnected. He sought lawyers specializing in asset recovery, but the news was always the same. The money had disappeared so completely that it would be almost impossible to recover it. The next morning came the confirmation of what he already knew to be inevitable. The court officers arrived with a seizure order that included the mansion, the cars, and practically everything of value. His main bank account was blocked, and his credit cards were cancelled instantly. The housekeeper cried when she learned that she would be fired. The girl watched the movement of the men in suits removing furniture and valuables without fully understanding what was happening, but realizing that something very bad was underway. "We're going to have to leave here," said the entrepreneur, kneeling in front of her again. "Where to?" she asked, showing no fear. "To a smaller place," he replied, trying to smile. Much smaller. The apartment he managed to rent with the last resources he had left was in a simple neighborhood, far from the luxury he was used to. It had 2 small bedrooms, a modest living room, and a basic kitchen. For him, it was a dizzying fall. For the girl who had slept on sidewalks and fed on scraps, it was even more comfort than she had ever dreamed of having. The first days in the small apartment were a difficult adaptation for the entrepreneur, but revealed a capacity for resilience in the girl that deeply impressed him. While he struggled to accept the loss of his assets and the status he had built over the years, she seemed to flourish in that simple environment, helping him organize the few belongings they had managed to save from the seizure. "Can this room be mine?" she asked, pointing to the smaller of the 2 rooms, which barely fit a single bed and a small wardrobe. "Of course," he replied, watching as she explored every corner of the space with genuine curiosity. Adapting to the new financial reality was brutal. The man who once moved millions in investments now needed to count every penny to buy basic food. His assets in stocks had disappeared along with everything else, and the few resources that remained were dwindling rapidly. It was during the second week in the apartment that the girl began to show the first worrying symptoms. She woke up one morning with a high fever and a dry cough that made her shiver. The entrepreneur, who had never taken care of a sick child, panicked. "It hurts here," she said, pointing to her chest, her voice hoarse and weak. He took her immediately to the nearest public hospital, where they faced a huge line of people waiting for care. The contrast with the private hospitals he had always frequented was shocking. There were no privileges for those who had money, or for those who once had. After hours of waiting, a young and tired doctor finally examined the girl. Her expression grew gradually more serious as she went through the basic tests. "She's severely malnourished," the doctor told the entrepreneur. "She's probably suffered chronic malnutrition for years. This has drastically weakened her immune system. But she'll be okay, won't she?" he asked, holding the girl's small, warm hand. "We're going to do some more detailed tests," the doctor replied, avoiding a direct answer. "For now, she needs rest and medication." The tests revealed a condition that would change everything once again. The girl had developed a rare respiratory disease, aggravated by years of exposure to unsanitary conditions on the streets. Treatment would be long, expensive, and without guarantees of success. "How much is it going to cost?" asked the entrepreneur, already knowing he had no way to pay. With the complete treatment, including special medications and prolonged follow-up, we're talking about several tens of thousands, replied the doctor. Medicaid covers part of it, but the most effective medications need to be purchased. That night, while the girl slept restlessly due to the persistent cough, the entrepreneur stayed awake doing impossible calculations. His last resources barely covered rent and basic food for another 2 months. The child's treatment would cost more than he possessed in the world. It was then that he received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but distorted, as if the man was using some device to alter the tone. "We know you're having financial difficulties," said the mysterious voice. "Who is this?" asked the entrepreneur, feeling a chill down his spine. "Let's just say we're people who can solve your money problems. There's a job you can do for us." "What kind of job?" "Nothing too complicated. Just need to transport some merchandise from one place to another." "We pay well in cash." The entrepreneur hesitated. Even in the desperate situation he was in, some instinct warned him that this conversation would lead to no good. "What kind of merchandise?" "Medicine," replied the voice. "Medications that arrive from overseas and need to be distributed quickly. Totally legal, just without all the official red tape." The irony of the situation did not go unnoticed. He needed money to buy medicine for the girl, and someone was offering him work transporting medicine. It seemed like an impossible coincidence, but his desperate situation did not allow for much questioning. "How much do you pay?" he asked finally. "Enough to solve your immediate problems. And if the job is done well, it could become something regular." 2 nights later, he found himself driving down dark roads on the outskirts of the city, transporting boxes he couldn't open to a destination he didn't fully know. The car he was using was not his. It had been provided by the mysterious contractors, and the instructions were simple: drive, deliver, no questions asked. During the first trips, he tried to convince himself that he was really transporting legal medicines. The boxes had medical labels, the destinations were always pharmacies or clinics, and the money arrived as promised. He managed to buy the medicines for the girl and keep the apartment. But gradually, details began to bother him. Deliveries always happened during the early morning hours. The contacts never fully identified themselves. And there was a tension in the meetings that suggested something much more dangerous than simple drug distribution. The girl, even sick, realized that something had changed in his behavior. "You're sad," she observed one afternoon when he returned from another nighttime delivery. "I'm just tired," he lied, avoiding looking into the child's large, perceptive eyes. "On the street, I always knew when adults were lying," she said with devastating simplicity. "You're afraid of something." It was true. The longer he spent making those deliveries, the more certain he was that he was involved in something illegal. But with each day that the girl improved with the expensive medications he managed to buy, the harder it became to stop. The situation became complicated when he began to recognize some of the faces at the delivery points. They were men he had seen before, in circumstances he would rather forget. One of them, in particular, had a distinctive scar on his face that triggered a disturbing memory. It was then that the piece of the puzzle fell into place in a terrifying way. The scar belonged to one of the men who had attacked him at the abandoned circus. The same group that had beaten him was now employing him without him knowing. The following night, during a delivery to a warehouse in the suburbs, he was finally sure. He clearly saw 3 of the 5 men who had worn clown masks on that terrible day. They recognized him too, and sinister smiles spread across their faces. "Surprised?" asked one of them, approaching the car where the entrepreneur remained petrified. You knew who I was from the beginning," he murmured, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. "Of course we knew," laughed another. "We thought it was quite funny that the big boss of the company that fired us now works for us." The revelation was like a punch to the stomach. Those men were former employees of his construction company, laid off during a cost-cutting measure he had authorized months before. The attack at the circus had not been random. It was personal revenge. "And now you're going to continue working for us," said the leader of the group, "because we know you have a sick child at home. It would be a shame if something happened to her." The entrepreneur felt the blood run cold. He had fallen into an elaborate trap, and now both he and the girl were trapped in that situation. The men he had considered simple criminals were, in fact, people who knew his life, his weaknesses, and exactly how to manipulate him. That morning, returning to the apartment with dirty money in his pocket and the weight of blackmail on his shoulders, he looked at the girl sleeping peacefully and realized that his attempt to save her could end up destroying them both. The following months turned into a calculated nightmare. The entrepreneur continued making the nighttime deliveries, increasingly aware that he was transporting counterfeit medicines and illegal substances. The money he received allowed him to maintain the girl's treatment, but the psychological price was becoming unbearable. The child, in turn, showed signs of physical improvement, but began to develop a keen perception of the change in the behavior of the man who had become her only family. She noticed how he came home in the early hours of the morning, always tense and avoiding eye contact. "Why do you go out every night?" she asked one morning as they had breakfast in the heavy silence that had become routine. "Work," he replied, the word coming out with difficulty. "What kind of work do you do at night?" she insisted, demonstrating a curiosity that went beyond her 4 years. He didn't know how to answer, how to explain to a child that the man she trusted was involved with criminals, how to tell her that every medicine that was curing her had been paid for with money from illegal activities. The situation became even more complicated when his ex-wife reappeared unexpectedly. She knocked on the apartment door on a rainy afternoon, wearing expensive clothes and sporting a belly that revealed an advanced pregnancy. "We need to talk," she said, pushing the door and entering without being invited. The girl, who was playing in the living room, immediately hid behind the sofa upon seeing the woman who had shown so much disgust for her months before. The socialite did not even look in the direction of the child, focusing all her attention on her ex-husband. "I'm 5 months pregnant," she announced without preamble, "and the child is yours." The entrepreneur felt the ground collapse beneath his feet once again. "How can you be sure?" "Because I haven't been with anyone else in the last 6 months, she replied with calculated coldness. "And I want alimony. 50,000 a month until the child turns 18. The amount was absurd, especially considering his current financial situation. All the money he managed to gather with the illegal deliveries barely covered rent, food, and medication for the girl. Alimony of that amount would be impossible to pay. "You know I don't have that money," he said, trying to keep calm. "Then get it," she retorted, "because if you don't, I'll go to court, and I'm sure a judge will be very interested to know how you are supporting this situation here." She gestured vaguely in the direction where the girl was hiding, making it clear that she would use the child as a weapon if necessary. The implicit threat was clear. If he didn't pay the alimony, she would make him lose custody of the girl. After his ex-wife left, the apartment was plunged into tense silence. The girl came out of her hiding place and approached him with cautious steps. "Is she going to take you away from me?" she asked in a small voice that broke his heart. "Never," he promised, hugging her tightly. "I won't let anyone separate us." But the promise sounded hollow, even to him. He was caught between criminals who were blackmailing him and an ex-wife who threatened to destroy what little was left of his life. The money from the illegal deliveries, which had previously seemed to solve his problems, was now clearly insufficient for all the demands. The following week, during a routine medical appointment for the girl, something happened that would change everything again. The hospital's social worker, a middle-aged woman with gentle but perceptive eyes, asked questions that made the entrepreneur extremely nervous. "How did you two meet?" she asked, observing the interaction between him and the child. "She needed help, and I found her," he replied, trying to sound natural. "And your legal situation regarding the child? Are there custody documents?" "We're still resolving that part," he lied, feeling cold sweat running down his back. The social worker made careful notes, and something in her expression suggested distrust. During the medical examination, she took advantage of a moment when he left the room to talk to the girl alone. "Do you like living with him?" she asked gently. "I like it a lot," the girl replied sincerely. "He takes care of me and gives me medicine when I'm sick." "And where does the money for the medicine come from?" The innocent question triggered a response that would change everything. The girl, with the natural honesty of children, told about how he went out every night to work, how he always came back very tired and worried, and how sometimes she heard strange telephone conversations. "He talks to people who make him scared," she said, "and sometimes he cries when he thinks I'm not watching." 2 weeks later, the entrepreneur received an official visit that confirmed his worst fears. Social workers and an officer arrived at the apartment with a court order to investigate the girl's living conditions and the legality of his guardianship. "There are reports that the child is in an irregular situation," explained the social worker, who had questioned them at the hospital. "We need to do a full assessment." During the investigation, which lasted several hours, it became clear that he had no legal documentation about the girl. There was no birth certificate, no adoption process, not even an official record that she existed. "Where are her biological parents?" asked the officer. "We don't know," replied the entrepreneur, realizing how inadequate the truth sounded. "She was alone when I found her." "And how can you prove that?" He couldn't. There were no witnesses to the rescue at the circus. There were no official records of the period she lived on the streets. To the authorities, it seemed that he had simply appeared with a child without a plausible explanation. The situation worsened when the questions turned to his financial situation. How could a man who had lost everything afford expensive medications? Where did the money come from to support them? "I work at night," he said, trying to maintain the original version. "In what exactly?" "Deliveries." "For which company?" The lies began to contradict each other, and it became obvious that he was hiding something important. The social worker made more notes, and the officer observed everything with an increasingly severe expression. "We're going to need to take the child temporarily," announced the social worker finally, "until the whole situation is clarified." The girl's reaction was instantaneous and devastating. She clung to the entrepreneur's legs with desperate force, screaming that she didn't want to leave. Her tears were real and desperate, demonstrating a genuine bond that had formed between them. "Please don't take me," she screamed. "He's good to me. He saves me every day." But the rules were clear. A child without documentation, living with a man without legal authorization and in suspicious financial circumstances, needed to be protected by the state. It didn't matter the love that existed between them. It didn't matter that he really took good care of her. As they carried the crying girl to the official car, she reached out her arms towards him, shouting his name. The entrepreneur stood at the apartment door, feeling completely powerless for the second time in a few months. That night, alone in the apartment that suddenly seemed immense and empty, he received another call from the criminals who controlled him. They had heard about the investigation and were not at all satisfied. "You've become a risk to our operation," said the familiar voice, "and risks need to be eliminated." The entrepreneur realized that he had lost not only the girl, but also the protection that his usefulness provided. He was alone, without money, without family, and now also without the child who had become the center of his life. The girl was taken to a temporary shelter on the outskirts of the city, a grey and overcrowded building where dozens of children in similar situations awaited legal definitions that sometimes never came. The place, although clean and organized, had an air of permanent sadness that seeped into the walls and poorly lit corridors. She was placed in a room with 5 other children, all in the same age group, but none shared her particular story. There were orphaned children, others taken from violent families, and some who had simply been lost in the bureaucratic system that was supposed to protect them. During the first days, the girl refused to speak to any adult at the shelter. She sat in the corner of her narrow bed, hugging a small teddy bear that the entrepreneur had bought for her weeks before, and watched the other children with eyes that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for someone so small. "She doesn't want to eat right," reported the caregiver responsible for the room during a meeting with the social worker, and in the first nights she cried a lot, calling for someone. Meanwhile, the entrepreneur was living his own personal hell. Without the girl to care for, without a clear purpose to continue, he found himself completely lost. The calls from the criminals had stopped, but he knew that this did not mean safety. It meant that they were planning something worse. It was during one of those dark nights that he made a desperate decision. He sought a lawyer specializing in child law, spending the last resources he possessed to try to regain custody of the girl legally. "Your situation is complicated," explained the lawyer after hearing the whole story. "There is no documentation, there is no formal adoption process, and now there are suspicions about your financial activities." "But I really take good care of her," insisted the entrepreneur. "She was dying on the street when I found her." "I believe you," said the lawyer, "but the legal system needs evidence, not feelings. We need to find a way to prove that your relationship with the child is legitimate and beneficial." The investigation process that followed was thorough and humiliating. Social workers reviewed every aspect of the entrepreneur's life, from his financial records to his personal references. They quickly discovered his recent bankruptcy, the conflicting separation from his wife, and the inconsistencies in his explanations about his current source of income. During this period, the girl in the shelter began to show worrying signs of regression. She stopped talking completely, refused to participate in the activities proposed by the caregivers, and had developed the habit of hiding under the bed whenever visitors or authorities arrived. "She is clearly traumatized by the separation," observed the shelter's psychologist during an evaluation. "There is a strong emotional bond with the male figure who cared for her. But there are also signs that she has experienced previous traumas," added the social worker. "Her reaction to abandonment is more intense than would be normal, suggesting that she has experienced significant losses before." It was then that something unexpected happened. During a routine visit to the hospital to continue treatment for her respiratory condition, the girl had a reaction that surprised everyone present. Upon seeing one of the afternoon shift nurses, she began to tremble violently and hid behind the shelter caregiver. "I don't want her to touch me," said the girl, the first words she had spoken in weeks. "She left me alone." The nurse, a woman of about 30 with a tired appearance and eyes that seemed to carry a deep sadness, was visibly shaken by the child's reaction. Her hands trembled as she tried to approach to perform the routine examination. "Do you remember me?" asked the nurse in a broken voice. The girl nodded, still hidden behind the caregiver. "You gave me to bad people. You promised you'd be back, but you never came back." The silence that followed was heavy and loaded with revelations. The social worker who had accompanied the girl to the hospital immediately realized that she was facing a much more complex situation than she had initially imagined. "Do you two know each other?" she asked, addressing the nurse. The woman hesitated for a long moment, visibly struggling with conflicting emotions. Her tears began to flow even before she could speak. She's my daughter," she confessed finally, her voice barely audible. The revelation echoed through the small office like a bomb. The social worker made frenzied notes as she processed the implications of that confession. The girl, in turn, came out of her hiding place and stared at the woman who had just identified herself as her mother. "Why did you leave me?" asked the child with devastating simplicity. The nurse knelt down, getting to the girl's height but did not dare to touch her. Because I was very sick. I had a disease in my head that made me do bad things. What kind of disease? A disease that makes people use bad medicines that make them confused and mean, she explained, struggling to use words that a 4-year-old could understand. The story that unfolded in the following hours was complex and painful. The nurse revealed that she had been addicted to drugs for years, a condition that had led her to make desperate decisions. When the girl was just a few months old, she had given her up for illegal adoption, receiving money that she used to buy more substances. But I got better, she continued, the tears not stopping from flowing. It's been 3 years since I used anything. I work here at the hospital. I have a normal life. And every day I thought about you. If you thought about me, why didn't you look for me? Asked the girl. Because I was afraid. Afraid that you would hate me. Afraid that you wouldn't forgive me. And mostly afraid that I wasn't good enough to be your mother. The social worker carefully documented every word of the conversation, realizing that she had discovered a fundamental piece of the puzzle. The child was not an orphan, as everyone had assumed. She had a biological mother who was alive, working at the same hospital where she was receiving treatment. How long have you worked here? Asked the social worker. 2 years, replied the nurse. I started right after finishing my rehabilitation treatment. And did you know she came here for appointments? The confession that followed was even more disturbing. The nurse admitted that she had recognized her daughter since the first time she'd appeared at the hospital, months ago, accompanied by the entrepreneur. She had watched from afar, secretly consulted her medical record, and even discreetly influenced the decisions about her treatment. I made sure to be on duty whenever she came, she confessed, and I advised the doctors on the best medications for her condition. I studied everything about her disease. The girl processed this information with the seriousness of someone much older. You were taking care of me without me knowing? I was trying. It was the only way I could think of to help you without messing up your life again. At that moment, something changed in the child's expression. For the first time since she had been separated from the entrepreneur, her eyes showed an emotion different from sadness and fear. There was curiosity, perhaps even a hint of hope. Is the man who takes care of me also sick? She asked suddenly. The question took everyone by surprise. Why do you ask that? Questioned the social worker. Because he gets very sad and scared, like you said you were. And he goes out at night to work, but always comes back very scared. The child's observation revealed a keen perception of the entrepreneur's situation that not even the adults had noticed. She had identified signs that he was involved in something dangerous, even without fully understanding the nature of his troubles. The nurse looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and sadness. You've always been very clever. Even when you were a baby, you observed everything. Finally, the girl asked a question that would change the course of everything. Can you help him too? Like you're helping me? The girl's question about helping the entrepreneur set in motion a series of events that no one could have predicted. The nurse, still shaken by the reunion with her daughter, began to ask questions about the man who had cared for the child during all those months. Is he a good person? She asked the social worker, demonstrating genuine concern. It's complicated, replied the social worker. He clearly cares about her, but there are aspects of his situation that are questionable. In the days that followed that revelation, the nurse began her own discreet investigation. Using her contacts at the hospital and her experience with people who had gone through desperate situations, she tried to better understand the entrepreneur's story and the reasons that had led him to care for a street child. Meanwhile, the girl at the shelter had become more communicative after reuniting with her biological mother. She began to talk about the man who had saved her, telling stories that revealed important details about his personality and character. He always gave me the best food, even when he didn't have much, she told the shelter psychologist. And when I had nightmares, he stayed awake with me until I could sleep again. "And what do you think about his night job?" asked the psychologist, trying to better understand the situation. "He didn't like it," replied the girl with certainty. "He always got sad afterward. And sometimes he cried in the bathroom, but he thought I didn't hear." These revelations painted the portrait of a man who had been forced to make difficult decisions, not out of greed or malice, but out of desperation. The nurse, who intimately understood what it meant to make terrible choices when you felt cornered, began to develop empathy for the entrepreneur's situation. It was then that she made a decision that would change everything. Using her time off from the hospital, she began to discreetly investigate the criminal activities in which the entrepreneur had become involved. Her previous experience in the world of drugs gave her knowledge about illegal networks that ordinary people did not possess. Through old contacts she maintained for professional needs, many hospital patients had similar histories to hers. She discovered disturbing details about the group that was using the entrepreneur. "They are known for blackmail," explained one of her contacts, a former addict who now worked as an informant for rehabilitation organizations. "They find desperate people and force them to work through threats." "What kind of threats?" "Usually involves family, children especially. They know that people with children are easier to control." The information confirmed the nurse's suspicions. The entrepreneur was not working voluntarily for the criminals. He was being coerced, probably through threats to the girl's safety. During this period, the entrepreneur himself was living a personal hell. Without the girl to motivate him, he had fallen into a deep depression. His savings were running out. He had lost the apartment for lack of payment and now lived in a rented room in a decaying boarding house in downtown. The criminals had stopped contacting him after the official investigation, but he knew he wasn't free. People like those didn't simply forget someone who knew their secrets. At any moment, they could reappear. And this time, it might not just be to use him as a transporter. It was on a particularly difficult night, when he was seriously considering giving up everything, that he received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was female, unknown, but there was something in it that made him pay attention. "Are you the man who was taking care of the girl who's at the West Side shelter?" asked the voice. "Who wants to know?" he replied, immediately on the defensive. "Someone who understands your situation better than you imagine," said the nurse. "I need to talk to you. It's about your daughter." The word daughter hit him like lightning. That's how he had started to think of the girl, even knowing that he had no legal right over her. "Who are you?" "I'm a nurse at the hospital where she was being treated, and I'm her biological mother." The silence that followed was filled with shock and confusion. How?" "It's a long story. Can we meet? There are things you need to know, and maybe I can help you." The meeting took place 2 days later at a small and discreet coffee shop in downtown. The entrepreneur arrived nervous and suspicious, but the nurse reassured him with her direct and honest approach. "Thank you for taking care of her," she said, as her first thing. "I know it wasn't easy." "She saved my life," he replied simply. "It was the least I could do." "It wasn't the least," she corrected. "It was much more than that. And I know from the medical records that you spent a lot of money on her treatment." They talked for hours. The nurse told her story, the addiction, the abandonment of her daughter, the rehabilitation, and the years of remorse and silent observation. The entrepreneur, in turn, recounted how he had lost everything, how he had become involved with criminals to pay for the medications, and how he was being blackmailed. "They used her against you," observed the nurse. "It's their standard tactic." "How do you know so much about it?" "Because I've been on the other side. I was once that desperate person who accepts anything to get what they need." It was then that she revealed her plan. During her investigations, she had discovered something important about the criminal group. They were being investigated by a federal task force that had been trying to infiltrate the organization for months. "You can be the key to taking them down," she explained, "but you need to be careful. If they suspect you're collaborating with the authorities, They kill me, he completed. Exactly. But if we can do this right, you can get rid of them and get your life back. And maybe we can work together to create a stable environment for her. The proposal was tempting and terrifying at the same time. Collaborating with the justice system meant risk of life, but it was also his only real chance to escape the situation he was in. "Why would you do this for me?" he asked. "You don't even know me." "Because you did for my daughter something that I couldn't do," she replied with painful honesty. "You were the father she needed when I couldn't be the mother she deserved." "And what happens to her in the meantime?" "She stays at the shelter temporarily. It's the safest place for her now. But if we can resolve this situation, well, maybe we can create something that works for all of us." The entrepreneur spent the whole night thinking about the proposal. It was risky, but for the first time in months, he saw a real possibility of a future, not just for him, but for the girl who had become the center of his life. The next morning, he called the nurse. "I'm in," he said simply. "Are you sure? There's no turning back once we start." "I'm sure. She deserves a better life than either of us has had so far." What neither of them knew was that the girl at the shelter had developed a plan of her own. Using the sharp intelligence she had developed during her years on the street, she had begun to subtly manipulate conversations with the social worker, planting information that she knew would lead the adults in the right direction. "Do you think my real mom and the man who saved me could be friends?" she asked during a session with the psychologist. "They're similar. They both got sick, but now they're trying to get better." It was a simple observation, but loaded with a wisdom that would force the adults to consider possibilities they might not have thought of on their own. The girl was, in her own way, orchestrating a reunion that could save them all. The collaboration between the entrepreneur and the nurse with the federal authorities began cautiously and meticulously. The agent in charge of the investigation, an experienced man in cases of criminal organizations, explained the risks and procedures they would need to follow. "You understand that once we start, there's no going back," warned the agent during the first meeting in a secure location. "If they find out you're cooperating with us, your lives will be in real danger." "We understand," replied the nurse firmly. "But this is our chance to give a normal life to a child who has suffered too much." The plan was complex and required absolute precision. The entrepreneur would have to re-establish contact with the criminals, pretending that he was desperate for money again. Meanwhile, the nurse would use her contacts to obtain information about the group's roots and methods. During the first weeks of this secret operation, the girl at the shelter began to show signs of emotional deterioration once again. The hope that had arisen with the reunion with her biological mother was being replaced by a deep sadness as the days passed without anything concretely changing in her situation. "She's regressing again," reported the shelter psychologist during a meeting with the social worker. "She's stopped eating properly and has returned to having constant nightmares." "What are the nightmares about?" "She talks about bad people taking away the good people, and she always calls for two different people, the man who took care of her, and now also for the mother she reunited with." The information reached the nurse through official channels, and she realized that time was running out. The girl was suffering from the prolonged separation, and each day that passed made her emotional recovery more difficult. It was then that the situation took an unexpected turn. During one of the surveillance operations, the entrepreneur discovered something that completely changed the perspective of the investigation. The criminal group was not only involved in smuggling counterfeit medicines, they were planning a much larger operation. "They're preparing a gigantic shipment," he reported to the federal agent during an emergency meeting. "I overheard conversations about an entire hospital being supplied with counterfeit medications." "Which hospital?" "I haven't been able to find out yet, but from the values they mentioned, it must be a large institution. And they're nervous because they need someone with internal access." The nurse felt a chill down her spine. Someone with internal access to a hospital. Do you think they might try to recruit her? Asked the agent. It's very likely, she replied, especially if they find out I work in the area of controlled medications. The situation became even more complicated when the entrepreneur's ex-wife reappeared dramatically. Now, with her pregnancy even more advanced, she arrived at the shelter where the girl was staying, claiming to have rights over the child. She was living with my ex-husband, argued the socialite to the social worker. That means I have partial responsibility for her. You didn't even know this child existed until recently, replied the social worker, clearly annoyed by the interference. But now I know, and I'm willing to take care of her properly, with stable financial resources. The allegation was absurd, but technically the socialite had some legal arguments. She had been married to the man who had cared for the girl. She partially knew the situation, and she could offer financial stability that neither the entrepreneur nor the nurse could guarantee at the moment. The girl, when informed about this new twist, had a visceral reaction. I don't want to go with her, she said categorically. She's mean. She looked at me like I was dirty. But she can offer a comfortable life for you, tried to explain the social worker. I don't want comfortable life with mean person, replied the girl with a simple but irrefutable logic. I want to stay with good people, even if it's in a small house. Meanwhile, the federal operation was reaching a critical point. The criminals had contacted the entrepreneur again, offering a substantial sum for yet another series of deliveries. But this time, there was a difference. They wanted him to bring someone he trusted to help. Someone who works in the medical field would be ideal, said the criminal contact during a call monitored by the authorities. We have a special operation that requires technical knowledge. The entrepreneur looked at the nurse during the meeting that followed. Both knew that this was the opportunity they were waiting for, but it also represented the greatest risk they would have faced so far. If I accept, said the nurse, I can find out exactly what they're planning. But if something goes wrong, something will go wrong if we don't act, replied the federal agent. They're about to put counterfeit medications into circulation that could kill hundreds of people. What about the girl? Asked the entrepreneur. If something happens to us, she'll stay with his ex-wife, informed the agent, based on the most recent legal information. Unless we can resolve this operation quickly and clear your situation. The decision was made that night. The nurse would infiltrate the criminal operation as a medical expert, while the entrepreneur would continue his normal deliveries. The goal was to find out the complete details of the plan and identify everyone involved before the counterfeit medications reached the patients. What none of them knew was that the girl at the shelter had discovered crucial information. During a casual conversation with other children, she overheard one of them mention that her mother worked cleaning the same hospital where the nurse was employed. My mum said there are strange people asking about the hospital's medications, said the child. She got scared because they offered her money to tell her about the doctor's schedules. The girl processed this information with the sharp intelligence she had developed. Even without fully understanding the implications, she realized that there was a connection between the problems of the adults who cared for her and the hospital where her biological mother worked. That night, during a visit by the nurse to the shelter, the girl shared her discoveries in a seemingly innocent way. Are the bad people who made my foster dad work at night also interested in your hospital? She asked directly. The question hit the nurse like lightning. Why do you ask that? Because a girl here said that they offered her mom money to tell secrets about the hospital, and bad people always offer money when they want to do wrong things. The child's observation revealed that the criminals were already infiltrating the hospital, using cleaning staff and other low-level workers to obtain internal information. This meant that the operation was more advanced than anyone had imagined. You're very clever, said the nurse, hugging her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. I learned to pay attention when I lived on the street, replied the girl. People who offer easy money always want something bad in return. That night, the nurse transmitted the information to the authorities, realizing that the operation would have to be accelerated. The criminals were already inside the hospital, and any delay could result in a catastrophe that would affect hundreds of innocent patients. The entrepreneur received the call from the criminals the next morning. "We expect you and your nurse friend tonight," said the familiar voice. "We have a special job that can solve all your financial problems." It was the defining moment. In a few hours, they would be face to face with the criminals, trying to dismantle an operation that could cost many lives. And somewhere in the city, a 4-year-old girl waited, unaware that her future depended on the success of a mission that she herself had helped to make possible. The night of the operation arrived, loaded with tension and expectation. The entrepreneur and the nurse met an hour before the scheduled time, both wearing microscopic listening devices provided by the federal team. The nurse had carefully studied the hospital procedures that could be relevant, while the entrepreneur mentally reviewed all the details he had observed during months of forced labor. "If something goes wrong," said the nurse as they checked the equipment for the last time, "promise you'll think of her first." "I promise," he replied. "But nothing's going to go wrong. We can't allow it." The meeting place was a warehouse in the industrial suburbs of the city, the same one where the entrepreneur had discovered the true identity of his blackmailers months before. This time, however, there was much more activity. Trucks were parked in the area, and men were moving boxes with military efficiency. When they arrived, they were greeted by the leader of the group, a man whom the entrepreneur recognized as being the most aggressive during the attack at the circus. His expression was a mixture of satisfaction and distrust. "Finally brought someone competent," he said, observing the nurse with calculated interest. "We need someone who understands hospital medications." "I understand," she replied, keeping her voice firm. What exactly is the job? What was revealed in the following hours surpassed the worst expectations of the federal investigation. The criminals were not just planning to infiltrate counterfeit medications into one hospital. They were organizing an operation that would affect dozens of medical institutions throughout the metropolitan area. "We have contracts with suppliers that supply 15 different hospitals," explained the leader as he showed maps and detailed lists. "You will help us replace the original medications with ours without anyone noticing." "And if someone finds out?" asked the entrepreneur, feigning concern only for his own safety. "Nobody will find out if you do it right," replied another member of the group. "The medications we produce are visually identical to the originals. The difference is that they cost 10 times less to manufacture." The nurse felt nauseous as she fully understood the implications. Counterfeit medications in 15 hospitals meant thousands of patients receiving ineffective or potentially lethal treatments. Children, the elderly, people in critical condition, all would be at mortal risk. "When do we start?" she asked, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "Tomorrow morning," replied the leader. "You will use your access to the hospital to map the internal distribution routes. Then during the weekend, when there is less supervision, we will make the replacements." For the next 3 hours, they received detailed instructions about the plan. The operation was sophisticated and well-planned, involving corrupt employees at multiple levels of the hospitals, from cleaners to pharmacy supervisors. The money involved was substantial, millions of dollars in profits for the organizers. "Your share of the profit will be enough to solve all your problems," said the leader to the entrepreneur. "And there will still be enough left to guarantee a comfortable life for that girl you protect so much." The mention of the child made the entrepreneur's blood run cold. They knew about her. They knew he cared about her well-being. It was a subtle but clear threat. Cooperate, or she will suffer the consequences. When they finally left the warehouse, it was past midnight. In the car, away from the criminals' microphones, They could talk freely for the first time in hours. "It's worse than we imagined," said the nurse, her voice trembling with anger and horror. "If this operation goes ahead, hundreds of people will suffer." "And they know about her," replied the entrepreneur. "It wasn't an accident that they mentioned the girl. It's to make sure we don't try anything. Then we have to be even more careful." The next morning, the nurse arrived at the hospital where she worked with a sense of surreal normalcy. Her colleagues greeted her as usual, patients received routine care, and life went on as usual. But she knew that beneath that normalcy, a criminal operation was about to transform that place of healing into an instrument of devastation. Following the instructions she had received, she began to discreetly map the routes of medication distribution. She observed the delivery schedules, identified the points of least supervision, and documented the security procedures that would have to be circumvented. Meanwhile, at the shelter, the girl was living through a deep emotional crisis. The prospect of being handed over to the entrepreneur's ex-wife was becoming more real every day, and she couldn't hide her despair. "I don't want to go with her," she repeated constantly to any adult who would listen. "She doesn't like me. She'll send me away again." The social worker tried to reassure her, but knew that the child was right to worry. The socialite had made it clear that her interest in the girl was more related to legal and financial issues than to any genuine desire to be a mother. "What if I behave very badly?" asked the girl to the psychologist during a session. "Can she decide she doesn't want me anymore? Why do you want to behave badly?" "Because if she doesn't want me, maybe they'll let me stay with my real mom and the man who saved me." The child's logic was painfully clear. The little girl was willing to sacrifice herself, to be seen as a problem, if it increased her chances of staying with the people who genuinely cared for her. That afternoon, something unexpected happened at the hospital. During her reconnaissance mission, the nurse witnessed a situation that changed everything. A 4-year-old child was admitted in critical condition after a severe allergic reaction to medication. As the medical team fought to stabilize the child, the nurse couldn't help but think of her own daughter. The girl on the gurney was practically the same age, the same dark hair, and for a terrifying moment she imagined what it would be like if it were her child there. "It's a reaction to the antibiotic she was taking," explained the attending physician, Dr. Ramsey. "It appears the medication didn't have the proper concentration of the active ingredient." The information hit the nurse like a lightning bolt. A medication with inadequate concentration, exactly the type of problem counterfeit drugs would cause. The hospitalized child was a sample of what would happen on a massive scale if the criminal operation succeeded. That night, she called Agent Davies, the federal agent in charge of the investigation. "We need to expedite everything," she said urgently. "There are already signs that compromised medications are reaching patients." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I saw a child almost lose her life today because of a medication that didn't work properly." "All right, we'll move the operation to tomorrow night." What none of them knew was that the criminals had also decided to accelerate their plans. During an emergency meeting at the warehouse, the group's leader had received information that made him extremely nervous. "There are rumors that federal authorities are investigating counterfeit drug operations in the region," reported one of his contacts, Dominic. "We need to finalize everything this weekend and then disappear for a while. What if they discover our operation? That's why we're going to do it all at once. We replace the medications in all 15 hospitals simultaneously, collect the cash, and vanish before anyone realizes what happened." The decision to anticipate the operation meant the nurse and the businessman would have less than 24 hours to provide the authorities with all the information needed to halt a plan that could affect thousands of lives. Meanwhile, at the West Side shelter, the street kid had another one of her recurring nightmares. But this time, she woke up with an uncanny certainty. Something significant was about to happen, and somehow the people she loved were in danger. "I need to talk to my mom," she told the night caregiver, Rhonda. It's urgent. Now's not a time for visits, Rhonda replied gently. But she's in danger, the girl insisted with a conviction that impressed the adult. I know it. Not fully understanding where that certainty came from, Rhonda decided to make an exceptional call. It was almost midnight when the phone rang at the nurse's apartment, who was just finishing the preparations for the next day's operation. Your daughter's very agitated, Rhonda informed her. She insists you're in danger and wants to talk to you. The nurse felt a chill down her spine. How could a 4-year-old know she was about to face the most dangerous situation of her life? Rhonda's call left the nurse deeply troubled. She decided to make an extraordinary visit to her daughter, even though it was almost midnight. When she arrived at the shelter, she found the street kid awake, sitting on her bed, as if she had been waiting for her. I knew you were coming, the child said, hugging her mom with unusual force. How did you know I was in danger? Asked the nurse, genuinely impressed with her daughter's intuition. Because I learned to feel when bad things are going to happen, the girl replied with seriousness beyond her years. On the streets, I always knew when I had to hide. And what do you feel now? That you and the man who takes care of me are going to do something very dangerous to save other people, but I also feel that it might go wrong. The accuracy of the observation left the nurse speechless. Without understanding how, her daughter had captured the essence of the situation they were facing. If something happens to me, the nurse said carefully, I want you to know that everything I'm doing is to try to be the mom you always deserved. I know, replied the girl, but I want you to promise me one thing. What? If things get too dangerous, you run. You and the businessman run and then come back for me. I don't want you to get hurt because of me. The maturity of the request broke the nurse's heart. That street kid who had lost everything multiple times was asking the only people who cared about her to prioritize their own safety. The conversation was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of the social worker, Ms. Albright, even though it was an unusual time for an official visit. She brought news that would further complicate the already complex situation. There's been a change in the legal proceedings, she announced with a serious expression. Mr. Harrison's ex-wife obtained an expedited court order. She can assume temporary custody starting tomorrow. The impact of the news was devastating. The nurse felt as if the floor was disappearing beneath her feet. That's impossible. I'm her biological mother. Yes, but you don't have adequate legal documentation, and your situation is considered unstable due to a history of substance abuse, explained Ms. Albright regretfully. The ex-wife, on the other hand, has verifiable financial resources and social stability. But she doesn't really want to take care of the child, protested the nurse. Legally, that doesn't matter. She's demonstrated formal interest and can offer a suitable home. The girl listened to the entire conversation in silence, processing the implications with the keen intelligence she had developed. When is she coming to get me? She asked finally. Tomorrow afternoon, replied Miss Albright. Then we have until tomorrow morning, said the girl, looking directly at the nurse, to do what you need to do. It was a simple observation, but loaded with meaning. The child had understood that the operation against the criminals had to happen before her legal situation was definitively altered. That morning, the nurse met with the businessman, Ethan, and Agent Davies for an emergency meeting. The pressure of time had become critical on multiple fronts. We have information that they're starting the medication swaps tomorrow, reported the agent. We can't wait any longer. And I have until tomorrow afternoon before I lose any chance of getting my daughter back, added the nurse Willow. Then we do everything tomorrow, decided Ethan. In the morning, during normal business hours, when there's more activity in the hospital and our presence won't attract attention. The final plan was crafted with military precision. Willow would document exactly where and when the criminals would make the replacements, while Ethan would accompany them as he had before. Agent Davies and his team would be strategically positioned to intervene at the exact moment. "Remember," warned the agent, "you're not trained agents. If something goes wrong, pull back immediately. Don't try to be heroes." When dawn broke, the operation began. Willow arrived at the hospital at her usual time, but with more sophisticated recording equipment hidden in her clothing. She knew that every word, every action would be crucial to dismantling the criminal network. The first criminals arrived disguised as employees of a legitimate medical supply company. Their uniforms were convincing, their documents looked authentic, and they moved with the confidence of those who had the right to be there. "We start with the most expensive medications," instructed the group leader to Willow. "Antibiotics, controlled analgesics, oncology drugs, that's where we have the most profit." The list of medications to be replaced included treatments for childhood cancer, antibiotics for serious infections, and critical cardiac medications. Willow felt nauseous imagining children like her daughter receiving falsified versions of these vital drugs. For the first 2 hours, everything went according to the criminals' plan. They gained access to the storage areas, identified the batches to be replaced, and began the swap process. The operation was efficient and almost imperceptible. But then, something went wrong. One of the legitimate hospital employees, a seasoned pharmacist, noticed something odd about the new supplies. The packaging of one of the medications was slightly different from what he knew, and he decided to investigate further. "These batches have serial numbers that don't match our records," he told his supervisor, showing the boxes the criminals had brought. The supervisor, who wasn't involved in the illegal operation, immediately initiated a verification protocol that alerted hospital security. Within minutes, guards were being directed to the pharmacy area. Willow, who was monitoring the replacement process, saw the guards approaching and discreetly tried to alert Agent Davies through her communication device. But the leader of the criminals also noticed the abnormal activity. "Something's wrong," he said, looking around with growing paranoia. "There's too much security." "Maybe it's just normal protocol," Willow tried, remaining calm. "No," he replied, his distrust intensifying. "Someone ratted us out." It was at that moment that Ethan arrived for his part of the operation. He entered the hospital, unaware that the situation had already become complicated, heading straight to the agreed-upon location. When he saw the guards and perceived the tension in the air, he immediately understood that something had gone wrong. The leader of the criminals made a desperate decision. "We grab what we can and get out now," he ordered his team. "And we take her as collateral." Before Willow could react, 2 men grabbed her, while others began loading the boxes of falsified medications they had already managed to place in the hospital. The plan had turned into a kidnapping in the middle of a medical institution filled with innocent patients. Ethan saw the situation unfolding and made an instinctive decision. Instead of following Agent Davies' instructions to pull back, he headed straight to where Willow was being held hostage. "Let her go," he said, confronting the leader of the criminals. "You want to get out of here? Use me as collateral. I know all the exits, all the routes. She'll only slow you down." "Very noble," replied the leader sarcastically, "but now we have both of you." It was then that the federal agents finally managed to reach the scene. The hospital was partially evacuated, and a hostage situation was established in the heart of an institution that should be dedicated only to healing. Meanwhile, at the shelter, the street kid was having another one of her disturbing premonitions. She knew, without understanding how, that the people she loved were in mortal danger at that very moment. "Something very bad is happening," she told Rhonda. "I need to go to the hospital now." "You can't go anywhere," replied Rhonda. "And besides, your new family is coming to pick you up in a few hours." But the girl had already made a decision that would surprise everyone. Using the agility she had developed during years of living on the streets, She managed to leave the shelter unnoticed, determined to reach the hospital where she knew the people who cared for her were facing a life or death situation. The girl's escape from the shelter was discovered only an hour after her departure. Rhonda, who had done a routine check of the rooms, found the window ajar and the bed empty. The small teddy bear she always carried had been left behind, a sign that her departure had been a deliberate and urgent decision. "She can't have gone far," Rhonda said on the phone to Ms. Albright. "She's only 4 years old and on foot." But they underestimated the determination and survival experience the street kid had developed during her years on the streets. She knew shortcuts through the city that adults couldn't even imagine existed, and her small stature allowed her to move through spaces that others couldn't traverse. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the hostage situation was becoming increasingly tense. The criminals had barricaded themselves in the pharmacy area with Willow and Ethan, surrounded by federal agents who were trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution. "We want a van and safe passage to the border," demanded the leader through a cell phone, Sal DeMarco. "Or we start executing hostages." The federal agent in charge of the negotiation knew that the situation was critical. "I need time to organize transportation," he replied, trying to buy time for his team to find a way to resolve the crisis. "You have 2 hours," replied Sal. "After that, we start proving that we're serious." Inside the pharmacy, Willow and Ethan tried to remain calm as they observed the movements of the kidnappers. They knew the federal agents were working on a rescue plan, but they also understood that their own survival depended on not provoking the criminals. "Why did you guys do this?" Willow asked the leader, trying to establish some kind of human connection that could mitigate the situation. "Do what?" "Try to make money," he replied bitterly. "You rich people don't understand what it's like to need to survive." "I understand more than you imagine," she said calmly. "I've been through desperate situations too." "Oh yeah? And what was your great tragedy?" "Lost an investment in the stock market." "I lost my daughter because of drug addiction. I spent years destroying my own life and the lives of people who loved me." The confession caught the criminal by surprise. He had expected to find a privileged person who had never faced real hardship, but Willow's raw honesty forced him to see her differently. "And how did you get out of that?" he asked, his hostility diminishing slightly. "With help. People who cared about me when I couldn't care about myself, and now I'm trying to do the same for her." She gestured discreetly in the direction of Ethan, who had remained silent during the conversation. "He saved my daughter when I couldn't. And now we're trying to build a family together." The criminal looked at the two of them with a confused expression. "You guys are married?" "Not exactly," replied Ethan. "We're just two people who care about the same street kid and are trying to do what's right." While this conversation was taking place, the girl had managed to reach the outskirts of the hospital. Her several-hour journey through the city had been arduous, but her determination kept her moving. Now, observing the building surrounded by police cars and federal agents, she understood that her worst suspicions had been confirmed. The people she loved were truly in danger. Using the observation skills she had developed on the streets, she managed to identify a pattern in the movement of the agents. There was one side of the hospital that was less guarded, probably because the criminals were focused on a specific area of the building. With the natural agility of a small child, she managed to infiltrate the hospital through a service entrance that was being used to evacuate patients. In the midst of the confusion of people being removed from the building, no one noticed a small girl moving in the opposite direction. Inside the hospital, she used her memory of previous visits to navigate the corridors. She knew the pharmacy area was on the 3rd floor, and there were vague memories of how to get there through the emergency stairs. It was during this search that something extraordinary happened. One of the nurses who was helping with the evacuation recognized her. "Aren't you the daughter of the nurse who works here?" he asked, approaching her. "I am," she replied without hesitation. "My mom's in danger." "How did you get here?" "The building is being evacuated." "I came to help," she said with a simplicity that touched the nurse. "I know how to talk to bad people. I learned on the streets." The nurse was silent for a moment, processing the situation. There was something in the determination of that small child that prevented him from simply handing her over to the agents to be removed from the building. "You really think you can help?" he asked. "I think I can try," she replied. "If the bad people hurt my mom, I won't have anyone else." The brutal honesty of the statement made the nurse make a decision that probably violated all security protocols. "All right, but you stay with me, and we do exactly what I say." They went up to the third floor together, where the nurse managed to contact one of the federal agents. The initial reaction was one of disbelief and irritation. "How did a child get in here?" asked the agent. "She says she can help negotiate," explained the nurse. "She's the daughter of one of the hostages." "Impossible. We're not going to expose a child to a situation like this." It was then that the girl spoke for herself. "I know bad people," she said with a seriousness that impressed the agent. "I know how they think because I lived with them on the streets. And I know that the people who are in there don't really want to hurt anyone." "How can you know that?" "Because if they wanted to hurt, they would have already hurt. Really bad people don't make threats. They just do bad things." The observation was surprisingly insightful for a 4-year-old. The federal agent, who had negotiated dozens of similar situations, recognized that there was a valid logic in the girl's reasoning. "And what do you suggest?" he asked, more out of curiosity than a real expectation of receiving a useful answer. "Let me talk to them," she said. "Not as a cop or an adult trying to trick them, but as a child who understands what it's like to be afraid and desperate." The suggestion was so unusual that the federal agent needed to consult his superiors. During that pause, the girl took the opportunity to explain her reasoning further. "On the streets, when people got too angry and scared, sometimes only a child could make them stop being bad," she explained, "because a child can't hurt them, so they don't need to be afraid." "But what if they decide to use you as a hostage too?" "Then I'll be together with my mom and the man who saved me," she replied, with a simple but powerful logic. "And if we have to be in danger, it's better to be together." After 20 minutes of intense consultations, an unprecedented decision was made. For the first time in the history of the task force, a 4-year-old child would be allowed to participate in a negotiation with armed criminals. "But you'll be constantly accompanied," warned the agent. "And at the first sign of danger, you get out of there immediately." The girl agreed to the conditions, but internally knew that she would not abandon the people she loved, regardless of the risk. She had spent too long being abandoned to do the same to others. When the door of the pharmacy opened and the criminals saw a small child walking calmly towards them, accompanied only by an unarmed negotiator, the confusion was total. "What the hell is going on here?" shouted Sal, pointing his gun at the girl. "Hi," she said simply, stopping a few feet away. "I came to get my mom and my dad." The word dad, referring to Ethan, took everyone by surprise. But it was the total absence of fear in the child's voice that really disconcerted the criminals. They had prepared to deal with trained agents, professional negotiators, even other criminals. But no one had taught them how to react to a street kid who treated them as normal people in a normal situation. The presence of the girl in the pharmacy created an atmosphere completely different from the one that existed moments before. The criminals, who had prepared for a psychological battle with experienced authorities, suddenly found themselves facing a child who observed them with genuine curiosity, without demonstrating the fear they expected to provoke. "You shouldn't be here," said Sal, but his voice had lost some of its previous aggression. There was something disconcerting about threatening a child who looked at him as if he were just another ordinary person. "I know," replied the street kid calmly, "but my mom and my dad are here, so I need to be too." Willow and Ethan watched the scene with a mixture of terror and admiration. Terror, because the child they were trying to protect was now in the same dangerous situation as them, but admiration for the impossible courage she displayed. "Why are you holding my family?" asked the girl directly to the leader, with the devastating simplicity that only children possess. "Your family?" repeated one of the other criminals, confused. "Yeah, she's my real mom, and he's my dad who saved me when I lived on the streets," she explained, pointing to each one. "You're the bad people who made my dad work at night when he didn't want to." The direct and straightforward identification caught the criminals off guard. They weren't used to being called bad people by a street kid who seemed genuinely interested in understanding their motives. "We're not bad people," Sal, the leader, defended, a response that surprised even him. "We're just trying to survive. I was trying to survive too when I lived on the streets," the girl Juniper said, sitting down on the floor naturally, "but I never hurt anyone to get food." The simple observation created an uncomfortable silence. The group leader, who had spent months justifying his actions as necessary for survival, suddenly found himself confronted by a street kid who had faced even worse circumstances without resorting to violence. "It's different," he tried to explain. "You're a child. We have responsibilities, bills to pay." "My dad had bills to pay too," she replied, referring to Ethan. "That's why he worked for you, even if he didn't like it. But he never wanted to hurt anyone." Ethan observed the conversation with growing amazement. Juniper was, without any training or experience, conducting a negotiation more effective than many professionals could. Her brutal honesty and total absence of judgment were clearly affecting the criminals. "Do you have children?" Juniper asked suddenly. The question caught everyone off guard. Two of the criminals instinctively lowered their guns, and Sal hesitated before answering. "I have a daughter," admitted one of them, Ricky, finally. "She's almost your age." "And does she know you do things that hurt other people?" "No," Ricky replied, his voice getting lower. "She thinks I work at a regular company." "Then you know you're doing wrong things," concluded Juniper with relentless logic, "because otherwise you wouldn't hide it from your daughters." The impact of this observation was visible on the faces of all the criminals. Juniper had touched on something they preferred not to think about: the lies they told their own families about the nature of their activities. "Why don't you get jobs you don't need to hide?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Because it's not easy," replied Sal, his defensiveness diminishing gradually. "When you have a criminal record, nobody wants to give you a chance." "My mum had problems too," said Juniper, looking at Willow. "She used bad medicine that made her do wrong things, but she got better, and now she helps people at the hospital." Willow felt tears in her eyes as she heard the simple but precise description of her recovery journey. Juniper had understood and accepted her story in a way that no adult had managed to do. "And if people find out you did wrong things, but now you want to do right things," continued Juniper. "It doesn't work that way," said one of the criminals, Frank. "Once you're on the wrong side of the law, you're marked forever. But my mom managed to change," she insisted, "and my dad too. He lost all his money, but he still took care of me." Ethan realized that Juniper was, unconsciously, telling the story of both of their redemptions. She was showing the criminals that it was possible to start over, even after making terrible decisions. It was then that something happened that no one expected. Ricky, the criminal who had admitted to having a daughter, completely lowered his weapon. "I don't want my daughter to grow up thinking her dad's a criminal," he said, addressing Sal. "Maybe it's time to stop this." "Are you crazy?" reacted Sal. "If we leave here now, we're going to prison. And if we continue, maybe our daughters will be orphans," Ricky replied. "Look at her," he said, gesturing towards Juniper. "She's lost everything, but she still has hope. Our daughters deserve to have parents who can look at them without feeling ashamed." The statement created a visible crack in the group. Other criminals began to lower their weapons, clearly divided between the fear of the legal consequences and the emotional impact of the child's presence. Juniper, realizing the change in the atmosphere, asked a question that would be decisive. If you drop your weapons and say sorry, will the people outside let you try to be better dads? The question was directed both at the criminals and at the federal negotiator who had remained silent throughout the conversation. The agent, who was observing one of the most unusual negotiations of his career, understood that Juniper was creating an opportunity for a peaceful resolution. "If you surrender peacefully and cooperate with the investigation," he said carefully, "we can talk about agreements that allow you to maintain contact with your families." Sal looked around, seeing that he had lost control of the situation. His men were clearly being influenced by the prospect of a second chance that Juniper had presented so simply. "And if we hand over the weapons," he asked, "do you guarantee we won't be beaten or mistreated?" "I guarantee it," replied the federal agent, "and she can stay here to see that we keep our word." Juniper nodded gravely, as if formalizing an important contract. "I'll stay," she said, "because I want to make sure everyone will be okay." It was then that the strangest surrender that hospital had ever witnessed began. One by one, the criminals placed their weapons on the ground, guided by the promise of a 4-year-old child that all the people involved would be treated with dignity. Sal was the last to surrender, placing his pistol on the floor reluctantly. When he turned to Juniper, there were tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "Why?" asked Juniper, genuinely curious. "For reminding me that I was also once a child who deserved a chance to be better." As the federal agents arrested the criminals peacefully, Willow and Ethan ran to hug Juniper. For the first time in months, the three were together and safe, united not only by circumstances, but by an experience that had changed them all deeply. "How did you know it would work?" asked Ethan, still impressed with the street kid's courage. "Because I learned that really bad people are rare," she replied. "Most people are just confused or afraid, and when you show that you're not afraid of them, they remember what it's like to be a good person." At that moment, all three knew they had become a real family, forged not by documents or social conventions, but by love, sacrifice, and the extraordinary courage of a street kid who had chosen to save not only the people she loved, but also those who tried to hurt them. In the days following the resolution of the crisis at the hospital, the lives of the three underwent transformations that none of them could have foreseen. Media coverage of a 4-year-old who had negotiated with criminals spread quickly, but federal agents managed to protect her identity, referring to her only as the brave child. The legal impact of the situation was complex and unprecedented. The cooperation of the criminals, motivated by the encounter with Juniper, resulted in the discovery of a much larger counterfeit medication network that extended throughout the country. Their confessions allowed hundreds of people to be arrested and thousands of counterfeit medications to be taken out of circulation. For Ethan, cooperation with the authorities resulted in total immunity. All charges against him were dropped, and his forced participation in the criminal organization was officially recognized as coercion. More importantly, his courage in protecting Willow during the crisis was documented and publicly praised. Willow, in turn, became a respected figure at the hospital. Her decision to risk her life to protect innocent patients was recognized with a promotion to pharmacy supervisor, a position that came with important responsibilities and a salary that would allow real financial stability. But the most complex legal issue was the custody of Juniper. Ethan's ex-wife, upon learning of the dramatic events, withdrew her custody petition with a speed that revealed her true motivations. "I don't want to get involved with this kind of situation," she told her lawyer, making it clear that her interest in the street kid had been purely financial. The process of formalizing custody between Willow and Ethan took several weeks, but the result was groundbreaking. The court decided to grant shared custody to two people who were not married or in a romantic relationship, based entirely on the demonstrated well-being of the street kid and the emotional stability they provided together. "This is a non-traditional, but clearly functional family," declared the judge during the final hearing. "The child has demonstrated strong bonds with both adults, and they have demonstrated exceptional ability to collaborate for her benefit." During this period of legal transitions, something unexpected happened with Juniper's health. Routine medical examinations revealed that her respiratory condition, which had been a constant concern, was showing signs of significant improvement. Doctors were surprised by the speed of the recovery. "Chronic stress can significantly exacerbate medical conditions in children," explained the responsible pediatrician, Dr. Albright. "Now that she is in an emotionally stable environment, her body is responding remarkably." "Does this mean she's going to be completely okay?" asked Willow during a consultation. "With the proper care and the stable environment you are providing, the chances of complete recovery are excellent," replied the doctor. The news was celebrated by the three as a victory that symbolized much more than just physical health. It represented the healing of an entire family that had been formed through extraordinary circumstances. Meanwhile, Ethan was rebuilding his professional life in a completely different way. Instead of trying to recover his old company or return to the world of big investments, he decided to create a small consulting firm that helped families in financial difficulties. His personal experience with asset loss and recovery made him uniquely qualified for this work. "I discovered that using my experience to help people is worth more than any fortune in stocks or Bitcoin I could accumulate," he explained during an interview for a local newspaper. Willow also made changes in her career. In addition to her responsibilities at the hospital, she began volunteering in drug rehabilitation programs, using her own story to inspire others facing similar struggles. "When you go through extreme situations and manage to get to the other side," she said during a lecture at a rehabilitation center, "you have a responsibility to help others find the same path." Juniper, now 5 years old, was flourishing in ways that surprised everyone around her. Enrolled in a small, welcoming school, she stood out not only academically, but also for her exceptional ability to resolve conflicts between the other children. "She has a natural ability to make people understand each other," reported her teacher during a meeting with the parents. "When there are fights on the playground, the other children often ask her to help resolve them." "Where does that ability come from?" asked Ethan, curious about the child's development. "I believe it comes from having experienced extreme situations very early in life," explained the teacher. "She has developed an intuitive understanding of human nature that is rare even in adults." At home, the dynamic between the three had established itself naturally and harmoniously. Ethan lived in an apartment near Willow's, allowing them to divide the responsibilities of caring for Juniper without logistical complications. They had dinner together every night, alternated who picked up and dropped off the child at school, and made all important decisions together. "Are you going to get married?" asked Juniper one night, with the direct curiosity that characterized her questions. "We don't need to get married to be a family," replied Willow. "We're already a family the way we are." "But do you like each other?" "We like each other very much," confirmed Ethan. "As friends who share something very important, the love for you." The answer satisfied Juniper, who had learned that families could take different forms than those she saw in books or on television. Her experience had taught her that love was more important than social conventions. 6 months after the events at the hospital, they received an unexpected visit. One of the criminals who had been arrested, Ricky, the man who had mentioned having a daughter the same age as Juniper, was being released after cooperating extensively with the authorities and demonstrating genuine rehabilitation. "I'd like to thank you personally," he said during a supervised conversation at the lawyer's office. "That conversation changed my life." "How?" asked Juniper, genuinely interested. "Because you reminded me of who I wanted to be when my daughter looked at me," he replied. "Now I'm working in an auto repair shop, earning little, but I can look my daughter in the eye without feeling ashamed." "And does your daughter know what happened?" "She knows that Daddy did wrong things, but that now he's trying to be a better person every day." The conversation deeply touched the entire family. They could see the lasting impact that Juniper's courage had had not only on their own lives, but on the life of a completely different family. That night, as they put Juniper to bed, she made an observation that perfectly summarized her extraordinary journey. "You know what I learned?" she said, hugging both Willow and Ethan. "That when good people come together to take care of each other, they can fix things that seemed impossible to fix." "Like what?" asked Willow. "Like broken families, hurt hearts, and people who got lost," she replied. "And most importantly, they can help other people find their families too." It was a profound wisdom coming from someone so young, but who had experienced more transformation and redemption in her 5 years than many people experience in a lifetime. Juniper had become not only the center of a non-conventional family, but also a symbol of hope for all who believed in the possibility of starting over. As she fell asleep between her chosen parents, all three knew that they had found something rare and precious. A family built not by chance or convention, but by conscious choice, mutual sacrifice, and unconditional love. It was the kind of family that only the most extraordinary circumstances could create, but also the proof that even in the most difficult situations, love always finds a way to flourish. 2 years had passed since that transformative day at the hospital, and life had taken on a rhythm of everyday happiness that none of the three had ever imagined possible. Juniper, now 7 years old, had become a vibrant and confident child, whose smile lit up any room she entered. At school, she was known as the girl who always found creative solutions to the most complicated problems. When 2 classmates argued over a toy, she suggested that they create a timer to divide the usage time. When a new boy felt excluded from the group, she organized an activity where each child taught something special they knew how to do. "She has an extraordinary ability to see solutions where others see only problems," commented the school principal during a meeting with the parents. "It's as if she has an intuitive understanding that all difficult situations can be improved with creativity and compassion." Ethan had consolidated his new consulting firm, which now served dozens of families per month. His reputation as someone who truly understood financial difficulties spread quickly, and he was earning not only enough to live comfortably, but also to create a substantial education fund for Juniper. "I've never felt so professionally fulfilled," he confessed during a Sunday dinner. "When you help a family avoid eviction or manage to restructure debts that seemed impossible, the money you earn has a completely different meaning." Willow had been promoted again, becoming the medication coordinator for the entire hospital. Her volunteer work with drug addicts had grown so much that she was considering writing a book about recovery and second chances. "I think our story could inspire other people," she said one night as they organized family photo albums. "Not just our story, but the stories of all the people we managed to help along the way." It was during this conversation that Juniper made a suggestion that surprised both of them. "Why don't you write the book together and tell how a family can be formed in different ways?" The idea was simple but profound. In the following months, the 2 adults began working on a project that documented not only their personal journey, but also the stories of other unconventional families who had found success through unusual circumstances. During this period, something unexpected happened. Juniper began to show interest in learning about her early years, asking questions about the time she spent on the streets before meeting Ethan. "I remember some things," she said one afternoon while drawing in her notebook. "I remember being very cold and very hungry, but I also remember people who were sometimes kind to me." "Do you want to talk about those memories?" asked Willow, prepared to deal with any trauma that might arise. "I want to understand how I got to you," she replied, "because I think my story can help other kids who are going through what I went through." The maturity of the observation impressed both parents. Even at 7 years old, Juniper already demonstrated a social awareness and a desire to use her experience to benefit others. It was then that they made a decision that would once again change the course of their lives. They decided to seek out the shelter where Juniper had temporarily stayed and volunteer regularly. "We want to help other children who are in the situation I was in," explained Juniper to the shelter coordinator during the first visit, "and we want to show that there is always hope." The impact of their presence at the shelter was immediate and profound. Juniper, especially, had a natural ability to connect with children who had experienced similar traumas. Her own story of overcoming offered tangible hope for those who felt lost. "Did you really live on the streets?" asked a 5-year-old girl during one of the visits. "I did," she replied honestly, "and it was very hard. But look where I am now. I have a family who loves me. I go to school and I have friends. You're going to have all that too." "How do you know?" "Because good people exist, and when you find them, your life changes forever." During these months of volunteer work, they encountered stories that deeply touched them. There were children who had been abandoned, others who had lost their families, and some who simply got lost in the bureaucratic system that was supposed to protect them. "Each child here has a unique story," observed Ethan after a particularly emotional afternoon. "But they all have one thing in common: they need someone who believes in them." It was during one of these visits that they encountered a situation that made them make the most important decision of their lives since they became a family. There was a 4-year-old girl at the shelter who had recently arrived in circumstances very similar to those that their daughter had faced. The child had been found alone on the streets, clearly malnourished and traumatized. She didn't talk to anyone, refused to eat properly, and spent most of her time hidden under her small bed. "She reminds me of me when I got here," said Juniper, observing the new street kid with deep compassion. "Can I try to talk to her?" What happened next was extraordinary. Juniper approached the traumatized child with infinite patience, talking softly about her own experience, offering small drawings, and simply remaining present without pushing. Gradually, over several visits, the new child began to respond, first with curious looks, then with small nods, and finally with whispered words. "Did you really have a family after living on the streets?" asked the child one afternoon. "I have one, and you're going to have one too," replied Juniper with absolute certainty. It was at that moment that Willow and Ethan looked at each other and knew, without needing to say a word, that their family was about to grow again. The following weeks were filled with paperwork, interviews, and psychological evaluations, but this time the process was smoother. They already had proven experience as parents, stable financial resources, and most importantly, a daughter who was eager to become an older sister. "I'm going to teach her how to draw," planned Juniper, "and I'm going to show her all the good places in our city. And most importantly, I'm going to tell her that now she has a family forever." On the day the new street kid arrived to live with them, the family organized a small celebration. There was nothing extravagant, just a simple cake, some colorful balloons, and a lot of love. "Welcome to our family," said Juniper to her new little sister Maisie. "I know you're still scared, but I promise you'll never have to be afraid of being alone again." As Willow and Ethan watched the two street kids playing together on the living room floor, they reflected on the extraordinary journey that had led them to that moment. "Can you believe it all started at that abandoned circus?" Ethan asked. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago," replied Willow. "And sometimes it feels like yesterday. And now? Now I know our story is still being written, and that the best parts are yet to come." That night, as they put the two street kids to bed, one who had become their daughter through extraordinary circumstances, and another they chose to save, Because they knew that multiplied love never diminishes, they understood that they had created something much bigger than a family. They had created a circle of hope that would continue to expand, touching other lives, saving other children, and proving that even in the darkest moments of human existence, there is always the possibility of transformation, redemption, and unconditional love. Juniper, who had once saved a businessman at the abandoned circus, was now saving her new little sister, Maisie. And so, the cycle of love and salvation would continue, passing from one generation to another, multiplying kindness and proving that family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about choosing to love and protect one another, no matter where they come from or what circumstances have brought them together. They had found the true meaning of wealth, not in dollars or investments, but in bonds that no financial crisis could break, in love that no adversity could diminish, and in hope that no hardship could destroy. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought about my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.